Good evening. You know, as I've grown in the gospel, it would take me quite a while to kind of share my testimony, because I had a testimony that then became not my testimony, because my first testimony was how that I had been a really bad boy, and then I got saved, and then I was a good boy, and me being a good boy was what made me acceptable to God. And I went around telling the whole world about what a good boy I was. In foreign countries, it's amazing how people are looking for somebody to be a good boy, to be an example. And so I went around sharing that, knowing in my own heart that my own righteousness was not getting me anywhere with God. You know, no matter how much that we claim to be holy before God, we in our own selves know that we're not. When we begin to claim holiness, we really are claiming it in comparison to the person we're living with. And you know you're holy compared to the person you're living with, you know. But you see, when we're talking about biblical holiness, you can't measure yourself against your husband, against your wife, against your children. And I know a lot of us parents begin to feel really holy about the time our kids turn 14, 15 years old. And those little heathen make us look like we are saints. And that's really our pass card to holiness, is that our children are proving that we really are right with God because they're doing so bad. Well, the more I studied and the more that I tried to hold that image, the more that I realized that without intending to be, that I was becoming a fake and a phony. I began to realize that the relationships that I was forging in my self-righteousness were not relationships at all, because I had to maintain a certain persona for them to accept me. And they were having to maintain a certain persona. They had to act like they were keeping a certain standard. I had to act like I was keeping a certain standard. So there really wasn't any fellowship of the believers, as we would call it. I remember going to church and in all of the different situations that we were in, and we had to schedule fellowship. You know, you had to have a potluck, you had to have a get-together, you had to have a this or that to get everybody together, because people in the church system that I was in didn't just naturally hang out with each other. And I finally realized after some time the reason we didn't just naturally hang out with each other is because we didn't want them around the house on a regular day. Because then they would see who we really were. That we couldn't maintain the facade. So I began to notice a lot of things, and most of them were about myself. And it put me on a search that I started trying to find something that the Jesus that I believed in and the heart that he had given me began to be kinder than the doctrine that I had. And I know that you can relate to that, because, I mean, that was the big thing for me. You know, I had a heart that I really wanted to express mercy and love and kindness to people, but my doctrine said, well, if they've done this, they've got to be excommunicated, and if they've done that, then they've got to be reprimanded. If they've done this, they can't do that. They can't hold this office in the church. They can't do this. And yet my heart was much more compassionate to these people than my doctrine was. And let me tell you something. The day that your heart is kinder than your doctrine, be assured that it's not your heart that's wrong. It's your doctrine. Anybody here ever be able to relate to the fact that your heart was kinder than your doctrine? Your doctrine said, you know, it's this way, bless God they did this, and bless God we do it this way. But yet your heart said something totally different. And you remember what it felt like to carry out what the doctrine said and how that went against everything within you? Man, but we had to do it. And we thought, well, bless God, we're being holy. We're holding a righteous standard. We are holding the standard of God. Now, when you're in that, you have to say God. It's not God anymore. It's God. So a transition began for me many, many years ago. And a lot of people, as I teach in depth on the gospel, a lot of people wonder, how did you get to those points to have those ideas? And as I was trying to search through my own heart what to share with you tonight, I thought, the best thing to do with a new group of people, because some of you here have listened to some tapes, some of you have listened to some of the things that we have to say, and some of you have not. So I really want to start out tonight by sharing with you the thing that came into my heart that set my entire belief system on a different path. And it's called the gospel of peace. The gospel of peace. When I started trying to figure out what the gospel was, I was preaching a gospel of healing, gospel of prosperity, a gospel of marriage, a gospel of husband, a gospel of wife, a gospel of everything. And then when I started looking at Paul's writings in particular, he only called two things the gospel. And he said it was other than the gospel of Jesus Christ. He defined it as the gospel of peace and the gospel of grace. Now this goes back into the, into the late 70s, that these thoughts began to come into my heart and into my mind. And I thought about them and studied on them for over 5 years. I remember so very clearly being in a meeting where that myself and T.L. Osborne were the guest speakers, and a couple of other people. And I remembered being up in my hotel room, and we had it was a very very nice hotel complex, and we were speaking in the grand ballroom downstairs. And I wasn't scheduled to speak that night. T.L. Osborne was speaking that night. And I had been going through these things, and I had been hearing so many things about God's judgment and God's anger and God's wrath. And the things that I was seeing, though, was making me question that. And just the moment that I would study through something, and I had, my mentors were people like Kenneth Hagin and Kenneth Copeland, and of the Word of Faith movement, and a lot of other people. Oral Roberts was also someone that I would have looked to really listen to hear truth from. And as I was studying this, and I began to question the issue of an angry God, and just the moment after I had studied and looked and searched, and I would just almost be ready to get up and, take this big chance and tell everybody God's not angry with you. That all of the anger and wrath of God was totally satiated at the cross. And whenever I would get close to that, just sure enough, I would be tuning in to one of my favorite speakers, into Kenneth Copeland, and Kenneth came on, and he was the last one. I thought, I'd heard Oral talk about, that God's angry and, God's going to punish people and on down the line. But Kenneth Copeland was kind of like my holdout, I just knew Kenneth wouldn't go there, And then I was listening to him on the radio, and finally he said it. God's not going to put up with this anymore, God's tired of this, and telling us that the judgment of God was coming to people who were not walking in complete obedience to the Lord. And I was discouraged. I was one discouraged person because I looked everywhere for somebody preaching or teaching what was coming into my heart. And I can tell you, I did not find one. Not a single one.